In the heart of a raging snowstorm, the veteran Jacob and his dog Cody had only one anchor, the faint, warm light from a neighbor's window. But then a sharp crack tore through the night, and that light vanished, plunging the world into absolute darkness. Without a moment's hesitation, Jacob commanded Cody to stay, then grabbed his axe and prepared to step outside. He was no longer a failure running away. He was a soldier with a mission. Somewhere out there, a mother and her daughter were completely isolated. Will he make it in time? Join us to discover this story of quiet courage. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence in the apartment was the heaviest thing Jacob had ever known. It settled over the empty rooms like a thick layer of dust, muffling the sounds of the city outside and amplifying the echo of his own weary movements. Each time he sealed a cardboard box, the screech of the packing tape sounded like a final, mournful cry. This was it, the end of a life, packed away into brown, anonymous squares. He stood in the middle of the living room, a tall man who carried his 50 years with a weary strength. His frame was lean but solid, a testament to a life of physical work. His short brown hair was flecked with silver at the temples, framing a face carved with lines of grief and failure, though a kindness still lingered in his tired blue eyes. He wore his usual attire, an unbuttoned plaid shirt of navy, gray, and beige over a plain gray t-shirt, paired with faded blue jeans and the sturdy work boots that had seen better days. Every part of him looked worn, from his clothes to the expression on his face. A low whine broke the quiet. Jacob looked down to see Cody, his 8-year-old German shepherd, staring up at him with intelligent, concerned eyes. Cody was a striking dog, his coat a rare and beautiful mix of wolf gray and patches of brilliant white along his chest and paws. He had been a gift from Sarah, Jacob's late wife, a fluffy puppy brought home just a year before the cancer took her in 2023. Now, the dog was the last living piece of that life, the last warm presence in a world that had grown cold and empty. Cody nudged his hand with a wet nose, as if to say, "I am still here." Jacob reached down and stroked the dog's head, his rough fingers sinking into the thick fur. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "It's just you and me now." But it wasn't okay. The boxes stacked against the wall were proof of that. They contained the remnants of a 30-year marriage and a construction business built from the ground up, all lost. After Sarah passed, Jacob had poured everything, his grief, his energy, his entire savings, into one large commercial project. It was supposed to be his masterpiece, a tribute to her belief in him. Instead, a dishonest partner and a cruel turn in the market had bankrupted him. The business, J.S. Builders for Jacob and Sarah, was gone. The house they had shared was gone. And now, this small rented apartment was about to be gone too. Lying on the kitchen counter was a crisp white envelope. It had arrived 2 days ago. Inside was a letter from his landlord, Mr. Henderson, a man with a professionally sympathetic but firm tone. The letter was an official eviction notice. He had 30 days. 28 of them had already passed in a blur of numb disbelief. The feeling of failure was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until it was hard to breathe. He had failed Sarah's memory. He had failed himself. He had failed Cody, who deserved a yard to run in, not a cramped apartment with a future on the streets. In a daze, Jacob walked to the last remaining box, a small one labeled Family. It held old photographs, birth certificates, and miscellaneous papers he hadn't had the heart to throw away. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a connection to a time when things had made sense. His fingers brushed against a thick, brittle manila folder. He pulled it out. Inside was a deed, the paper yellowed with age. It was for a small, forgotten plot of land in rural West Virginia. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man he barely remembered, and had been passed down to him years ago. He recalled his father mentioning it once, dismissing it as worthless, a patch of trees and rocks in the middle of nowhere. Jacob had forgotten all about it. He stared at the faded ink, the looping signature of his grandfather from 1973, and the small, hand-drawn map of the property. It was nothing. A piece of paper representing a patch of wild, untamed land. But right now, it was more than nothing. It was the only thing in the world he still owned outright. A desperate, reckless idea began to form in his mind. It was a crazy idea, the kind a man only has when he has absolutely nothing left to lose. He looked from the deed to Cody, who watched him with unwavering loyalty. He couldn't end up on the streets. Not with Cody. He wouldn't let them be separated. The decision settled in his soul with a quiet, grim finality. They would go. He would sell what little he had left, buy a bus ticket, and take a one-way trip into the unknown. He didn't know what he would find there. Maybe nothing more than rocks and trees, as his father had said. But it was a chance, a sliver of a possibility to start over from less than zero. The next few days were a painful blur. He sold his tools for a fraction of their worth. His old Ford F-150, his last symbol of independence, was sold to a young man who couldn't hide his excitement. Each transaction was a small death, another piece of his old identity stripped away. Finally, there was nothing left but 2 duffel bags, a bag of dog food, and a small roll of cash tucked into his pocket. He and Cody stood in the empty apartment one last time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the bare floor. The silence was still there, but now it felt different. It was no longer the silence of an ending, but the vast, terrifying silence of a blank page. "Ready, boy?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. Cody wagged his tail once, a gesture of absolute trust. For him, home was wherever Jacob was. Jacob clipped the leash onto his collar, took a deep breath, and walked out the door, not daring to look back. The bus ride was a long, rattling journey through the heart of the country. For 2 days, Jacob stared out the window as cities bled into suburbs, suburbs into farmland, and farmland into the rolling, endless green of the Appalachian Mountains. Cody lay curled at his feet, a warm and steady weight that kept the rising tide of panic at bay. With every mile that passed, Jacob felt the last threads connecting him to his old life snap one by one. There was no going back now. There was only the land, and the desperate hope that it would not be another failure. They were dropped off at a dusty station in a small West Virginia town that seemed to have been passed over by time. A single main street held a handful of storefronts, their paint faded by the sun. From there, a kindly old taxi driver, after a curious glance at the man with the large dog and minimal luggage, drove them the last few miles out of town, down winding country roads until the pavement gave way to gravel. "This is it," the driver said, pulling to a stop where the road seemed to dissolve into the forest. Jacob paid the man the last of his cash, leaving just a few dollars for emergencies. He and Cody stepped out, and the taxi kicked up a cloud of dust as it drove away, its departure sounding unnervingly final. The silence that rushed in to replace it was profound, broken only by the buzz of insects and the rustle of leaves in the wind. He stood at the edge of his inheritance and felt his heart sink. The hand-drawn map on the deed had not prepared him for this. It was not a plot of land. It was a wall of green. Towering oaks and maples formed a dense canopy, choking out the light. The ground was a tangled mess of thorny bushes, thick undergrowth, and fallen trees. It was wild, untamed, and felt less like a sanctuary and more like a challenge. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through his resolve. What had he been thinking? He couldn't build a life here. He couldn't even build a shelter. He was a fool, a desperate man who had chased a ghost of a memory into the wilderness to die. As despair began to set in, Cody let out a low growl, his attention fixed on something to their left. Jacob followed the dog's gaze and saw it. Rising above the trees like the rusted spine of some colossal, long-dead beast was a mountain of metal. It was a scrapyard, but not for cars or appliances. This was a graveyard of giants, Dozens of old train cars were piled haphazardly on top of one another, their steel bodies bleeding rust, their windows shattered like vacant eyes. Jacob walked towards it, drawn by a strange curiosity. The scale of it was immense. He saw old Pullman passenger cars, boxcars with their sliding doors ripped away, and tanker cars lying on their sides like beached whales. It was a place of endings, a final resting place for things that had once been symbols of power and progress. A figure emerged from behind a towering stack of steel wheels. He was a man built like the mountains he lived in, broad-shouldered and thick-chested, probably in his early 60s. He had a full beard, more salt than pepper, and a weathered face that looked as if it had been carved from oak. He wore a grease-stained work shirt and heavy denim overalls, and he wiped his hands on a red rag as he approached, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "This is private property," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "What do you want?" "I own the land next door," Jacob replied, gesturing vaguely towards the forest. "Just looking." The man grunted, his gaze shifting from Jacob to Cody, then back again. It was a look Jacob recognized, the kind of sizing up one soldier does to another, a quick, efficient assessment of threat and capability. "Name's Caleb," the man said, though it wasn't an invitation to friendship, "and this is my boneyard." "Jacob," he decided directness was the only path. "I'm in a tight spot. I was wondering if you'd be willing to sell one of these old cars, the cheapest one you've got." Caleb let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sell? Son, most of these are worth more as scrap than as anything else. What would you even do with it?" "Live in it," Jacob said simply. The skepticism on Caleb's face hardened. He looked Jacob up and down again, taking in the worn boots, the tired eyes, and the quiet dignity in his posture. "You don't look like the type to give up, but you look like you're close to it. You from the city?" "Used to be," Jacob admitted. "Figured. They all come out here thinking it's a fresh start. Most of them are gone by the first snow." Caleb was silent for a long moment, studying Jacob intently. "You ever serve?" he asked abruptly. The question caught Jacob off guard. "Army," he said. "A long time ago." Caleb nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Marines. Myself." He spat on the ground. "All right, here's the deal. I'm not going to sell you anything. You don't have the money for it, and I don't run a charity." Jacob's hope faltered. "Of course. It was a stupid idea. But," Caleb continued, holding up a thick finger, "I'm a man short, and I've got a mountain of work. I see you know how to handle yourself. I'll make you a soldier's bargain. You give me 3 months of hard labor, 5 days a week, sun up to sundown. You help me sort this metal, fix my fences, build a new shed. You do that, and I'll give you that boxcar over there." He pointed to a simple, sturdy-looking car sitting by itself. "I'll even move it over to your land with the crane. And you can take any scrap wood or metal you can find to fix it up. That's the deal. No pay, just the car and the scrap. An exchange of work for a home." Jacob was stunned. It was more than he could have hoped for. It wasn't a handout. It was a contract, a mission. It was a way to earn his survival with his own 2 hands. It restored a piece of the dignity he thought he had lost forever. "You've got a deal, Caleb," Jacob said, extending his hand. Caleb's grip was like iron, firm and decisive. "Good. You start tomorrow at 0600. Don't be late." He turned and walked back toward the heart of the boneyard without another word, leaving Jacob standing at the edge of the forest, a new, heavy but hopeful chapter of his life about to begin. That first night in the train car was a descent into a cold, metallic hell. After Caleb left, Jacob had used the last hour of daylight to clear a small space on the grimy floor, laying down his sleeping bag. But sleep was a distant country he could not reach. The steel walls of the boxcar seemed to absorb the deep, chilling cold of the West Virginia night and radiate it directly into his bones. A damp, musty smell of rust and decay filled his nostrils with every breath. Outside, the forest came alive with a symphony of unnerving sounds. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches scratch against the metal roof like skeletal fingers. An owl hooted somewhere nearby, its call a lonely, mournful question. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sent a jolt of primal fear through him. He was an intruder here, a soft city man completely out of his element, and the wilderness was letting him know it. Doubt, which had been a sharp point earlier, now became a suffocating blanket. He lay in the darkness, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. He saw Sarah's face, smiling at him from their wedding photo. He heard the roar of the bulldozers from his last construction site, the sound of his dreams turning to dust. He had dragged Cody into this mess, into this cold, dark tomb. It wasn't a fresh start. It was the end of the line. Regret was a bitter taste in his mouth, so strong it almost made him sick. Just as the despair threatened to swallow him whole, he felt a warm, heavy pressure against his back. Cody, sensing his master's turmoil, had crawled from the foot of the sleeping bag and pressed his body firmly against Jacob's. Mena. The dog let out a low, contented sigh, a simple sound of unwavering loyalty. In the crushing darkness, that warmth, that steady breathing, was an anchor. Jacob reached a trembling hand back and buried his fingers in Cody's thick fur. The dog licked his hand once. It was enough. It was everything. Jacob closed his eyes and, for the first time that night, felt a flicker of something other than despair. He wasn't entirely alone. Morning came slowly, filtering through the grime on the broken windows in weak gray shafts of light. Jacob woke up stiff and cold, but the terrors of the night had receded with the dawn. There was work to be done, a soldier's bargain to uphold. He couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. The first task was to make the boxcar habitable, which meant cleaning out decades of accumulated filth. It was a daunting job. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt, leaves, and unidentifiable debris. Cobwebs thick as cotton hung from the ceiling. He started by sweeping, using a stiff branch he found outside as a makeshift broom. Clouds of dust filled the air, making him cough and his eyes water. As he worked his way to the back of the car, Cody, who had been sniffing intently in every corner, suddenly became agitated. He stopped at a section of the far wall and began to whine, his nose pressed against the wooden paneling. Then, he started to scratch at one of the panels near the floor, his claws making a scraping sound against the old wood. "What is it, boy?" "A mouse?" Jacob asked, walking over. But Cody was persistent. He let out a sharp bark, then looked at Jacob, then back at the wall, whining again. Jacob had learned long ago to trust the dog's instincts. He knelt down and examined the panel. It looked the same as the others, but when he pushed on it, he felt a slight give. It was loose. Using the tip of his work knife, he pried at the edge. The old wood groaned in protest before popping free. Behind it, nestled in the dark, dusty space of the wall's interior, was a small, metal box. It was an old tin lunchbox, the kind workers used to carry, its surface covered in a thin layer of rust. His heart began to beat a little faster. With a sense of reverence, he reached in and pulled it out. He sat on the floor, Cody panting quietly beside him, and worked the rusty clasps open. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed cotton, were a small stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a few black and white photographs, and a small, leather-bound notebook. He picked up the photographs first. One showed a young man and woman, smiling, standing proudly in front of a half-built cabin. His grandparents. Another showed his grandfather, a man with kind eyes so much like his own, in a railroad uniform. He turned to the letters. They were from his grandfather to his grandmother, written during the years he worked on the railroad. They spoke of love, of hardship, and of a deep, abiding connection to this very land. Finally, he opened the leather notebook. The pages were filled with his grandfather's neat, cursive handwriting. It was a journal of sorts, filled with measurements, sketches, and notes about building. And then, he saw it. On a page dated 1973, there was a detailed sketch of a boxcar, almost identical to the one he was sitting in. It showed the car converted into a small, cozy cabin, with a bed, a wood stove, and a little porch. Below the sketch, his grandfather had written, "My dream, to take one of the old cars from the boneyard and give it a new life here on our land, a place of peace, a final station." Final station. Jacob stared at the page, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. A shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't his own desperate, crazy idea. He was, unknowingly, walking a path that had been laid out for him 50 years ago. The feeling was overwhelming. He was not an intruder here. He was coming home. He was finishing a story his grandfather had started. The suffocating weight of failure began to lift, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about honoring a legacy. He looked around the filthy, rusted boxcar, but he no longer saw it as a prison. He saw the sketch in the notebook. He saw a home. He leaned over and hugged Cody, burying his face in the dog's fur. "You found it, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You found it." The discovery in the tin box had changed everything. It had injected Jacob's veins with a sense of purpose that felt as real and solid as the steel walls of his new home. The oppressive weight of his past failures hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, making room for the quiet determination of a man with a mission. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a builder, a finisher of a legacy his grandfather had begun. The days that followed fell into a grueling but satisfying rhythm. At sunrise, he would report to Caleb's scrapyard. The work was brutally physical, sorting and hauling metal under the watchful, assessing gaze of the old Marine. Jacob never complained. He did what was asked, his movements economical and efficient, earning a silent, grudging respect from Caleb. In the afternoons, he would return to his own land, his mind filled with the sketches from his grandfather's notebook. He spent hours clearing the dense undergrowth around the boxcar, his axe, and saw biting into the wood with a steady cadence. He was carving out a space for himself in the wilderness, a small patch of order in a world of chaos. Cody was always nearby, sometimes chasing squirrels with boundless energy, other times lying in a patch of sun, his head on his paws, watching his master work. One warm afternoon, after a long morning of wrestling with rusted steel beams at the boneyard, Jacob was clearing a thick patch of thorny vines near the edge of his property. The air was buzzing with the sound of insects, and sweat trickled down his temples. Suddenly, a brown rabbit shot out from the undergrowth, a flash of panicked speed. Cody, who had been dozing, was on his feet in an instant. A low, excited bark escaped him, and before Jacob could even call his name, the dog was off, a gray and white blur crashing through the woods in hot pursuit. "Cody, no, heel!" Jacob yelled, but his voice was lost in the thrill of the chase. The dog disappeared over a small rise that marked the informal boundary of his land. Jacob sighed, dropping his axe. He knew Cody would never catch the rabbit, but he had to be retrieved before he got lost or caused trouble. Wiping his brow with the back of his hand, Jacob started jogging after him. As he crested the rise, the sound of a child's laughter, clear as a small bell, reached him. He slowed his pace, moving more cautiously. Through a clearing in the trees, he saw a small girl, no older than 7, sitting on the ground. She was surrounded by an intricate little fort made of twigs and moss. And sitting calmly in front of her, panting happily with his tongue lolling out, was Cody. The chase was clearly over. The girl, Maya, was a sprite of the woods. She had a cascade of unruly brown curls tied back in a loose ponytail and a smattering of freckles across her nose. Her bright, curious green eyes were fixed on Cody with pure, unadulterated delight. She reached out a small, hesitant hand and stroked the top of his head. Cody leaned into her touch, his tail giving a slow, happy thump-thump-thump against the ground. Jacob stayed back, a small smile touching his lips. It was a peaceful scene, a moment of simple joy. He was about to call Cody over when another voice, sharp and laced with alarm, cut through the air. "Maya, get away from that dog. Now!" A woman emerged from the trees, moving with a quick, purposeful stride. This was Eliza. She was in her mid-30s, with the same vibrant green eyes as her daughter, but hers were narrowed with suspicion. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore a simple work shirt and jeans that couldn't hide a wiry strength. She was a woman who was used to handling things on her own, and her entire posture was defensive, a protective wall around her child. "Maya," I said, "come here," she repeated, her voice firm. The little girl looked from her mother to the dog, her face falling with disappointment. She scrambled to her feet and ran to her mother's side, half hiding behind her legs. Jacob stepped out into the clearing, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. "He's friendly," he said, his voice calm. "I'm sorry. He was chasing a rabbit and got away from me." Eliza's gaze swept over him, taking in his worn clothes, the exhaustion etched on his face, the whole picture of a man living in a rusted boxcar. It was a cold, dismissive look, the kind reserved for something unpleasant you find on the bottom of your shoe. He could see a flicker of something in her eyes, a confirmation of a preconceived notion. He was the stranger from the city, the failure who had washed up on their shores. "You should keep your animal on your own property," she said, her tone clipped and devoid of warmth. She did not make eye contact, instead focusing on the spot where Jacob had been a moment before. "You're right. I apologize," Jacob said quietly. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to be overly friendly. He simply met the situation with quiet accountability. "Cody, come." Cody, hearing the command, immediately stood, gave Maya one last friendly look, and trotted back to Jacob's side, sitting obediently at his heel. The display of control did nothing to soften Eliza's expression. She took Maya's hand, her grip tight, and turned to leave. "Come on, sweetie. We're going home. It is a great for Inamar." Jacob and Cody stood and watched them disappear back into the forest. The woods fell silent again, but the peaceful atmosphere was gone, replaced by a lingering tension. Jacob looked down at Cody, who whined softly, as if sensing his master's troubled thoughts. He had faced the wilderness. He had made a bargain with a hard man, but this was a different kind of challenge. He had seen the look in Eliza's eyes. It wasn't just caution. It was a deep, painful mistrust, a wound from some old battle that had nothing to do with him, but whose scar he would now have to navigate. He was an outsider, and building a home here would mean more than just wood and nails. It would mean breaking down a wall of human suspicion, a wall far more formidable than any tangle of thorns. The awkward encounter with Eliza and Maya left a lingering unease in Jacob, but it did not deter him from his purpose. If anything, it reinforced the new rhythm of his life, a rhythm built on the solid foundation of hard work. The days became a blur of sweat and steel, of aching muscles and small, tangible victories. His mornings belonged to Caleb. The scrapyard was an organized chaos of metal, and Jacob learned its landscape quickly. He learned the difference in weight and value between ferrous and non-ferrous metals, the sharp clang of aluminum versus the dull thud of lead. He worked alongside Caleb, the two men often in comfortable silence, their shared military background creating an unspoken understanding. Jacob's steady, methodical approach to the grueling work continued to earn Caleb's quiet approval. There were no wasted movements, no idle complaints. He was a man who understood a mission, but the afternoons were his own. As soon as his obligation to Caleb was fulfilled, he would return to his land, his mind already mapping out the next step in transforming the boxcar. These hours were a testament to his resourcefulness. Money was a luxury he did not have, so the scrapyard became his hardware store, his lumber yard, his entire world of supply. He became an expert at reclamation. He would spend time carefully pulling rusty nails from old, weathered planks of wood, painstakingly straightening them on a flat piece of steel to be used again. He found a discarded boxcar door with a small, intact window and spent 2 days carefully cutting it out and fitting it into a new frame he built for his own car, letting in a precious stream of natural light. The roof, which leaked in 3 places, was patched with a sheet of corrugated tin he hammered flat. His grandfather's notebook was his guide, but his own hands, calloused and capable, were the tools that brought the vision to life. Cody was his constant shadow during this time. The dog would lie on a patch of freshly cleared earth, his head resting on his paws, watching Jacob with intelligent, devoted eyes. He was a silent partner in this venture, a living, breathing reminder of what was real and true in Jacob's life. One hot afternoon, Jacob was sanding a piece of reclaimed oak that he intended to use as a countertop. The repetitive motion of his hands was almost meditative. Suddenly, the quiet of the woods was broken by a sharp, frustrated sound from the direction of Eliza's property. It was the sound of wood splintering, followed by a muttered curse. He paused his work, listening. He heard it again, a sound of pure exasperation. Curiosity got the better of him. Wiping the sawdust from his hands, he walked quietly to the rise that separated their properties, keeping himself partially hidden behind a large maple tree. Through the leaves, he could see Eliza struggling with a section of her fence. A thick wooden post had rotted through at the base and snapped, causing a whole section of wire fencing to sag pathetically. A small flock of chickens was already testing the new boundary, clucking and pecking their way towards freedom. Eliza was trying to prop the broken post back up with a large rock, but every time she let go, it would wobble and fall again. Her face was flushed with effort and annoyance. Jacob hesitated. The memory of her cold dismissal was still fresh. He was an unwelcome presence, the last person she would want help from. He should just turn around, go back to his work, and mind his own business. But he couldn't. He saw the practical problem, the simple physics of it, and the builder in him, the part that knew how to fix things, wouldn't let him walk away. He took a breath and stepped out from behind the tree. "Looks like you've got a stubborn post there," he called out, his voice even and calm, careful not to startle her. Eliza jumped, spinning around. Her expression hardened instantly when she saw him. The defensive wall went right back up. "I can handle it," she said, her tone sharp. "I'm sure you can," Jacob replied, not taking a step closer. "But that post is rotted clean through. Propping it up won't hold for long. You need to dig it out and set a new one." She glared at the broken post, then back at him, her pride warring with the frustrating reality of the situation. He was right, and she knew it. "I've built a few fences in my time," Jacob continued, keeping his tone light and non-threatening. "I could give you a hand. It would be faster with two people." "Seat and I." Eliza was silent for a long moment, her eyes studying him. She saw the sawdust on his shirt, the ingrained dirt in the lines of his hands. Every day for weeks from her kitchen window, she had seen him. She had seen him leave at dawn and return in the afternoon. She had heard the steady, rhythmic sounds of his saw and hammer, sounds that continued until dusk. This was not the picture of the lazy, defeated city man she had imagined. This was the picture of relentless, back-breaking work. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, she gave a stiff nod. "Fine," she said, as if granting a major concession. Jacob walked over, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. He didn't try to make small talk. He simply focused on the task. "I've got a post-hole digger back at my place," he said, "and I think I saw some solid cedar posts over at Caleb's that would do the trick. I'll be right back." He returned a few minutes later with the tools. Working together, but mostly in silence, they dug out the rotted stump, cleared the hole, and set the new, sturdy cedar post. Jacob's movements were sure and efficient. He made sure the post was perfectly plumb, packed the dirt around it firmly, and then expertly re-stretched the wire fencing and stapled it securely. In less than an hour, the fence was stronger than it had been before. When they were finished, they stood back. The repaired section was straight and solid. Eliza looked at it, then at Jacob. The hostility in her eyes had been replaced by a grudging respect. "Thank you," she said. And this time, the words were genuine. I wouldn't have been able to do that on my own." "You're welcome," Jacob said with a small nod. He gathered his tools. It should hold for a good long while. He turned and walked back toward his property without another word, leaving her standing by her newly fixed fence. Eliza watched him go, a thoughtful, complicated expression on her face. The wall of mistrust she had built around herself hadn't crumbled, but for the first time, a small, undeniable crack had appeared in it. The fence repair marked a subtle shift in the air between the two properties. The tension didn't vanish, but it thinned, like morning fog burning off under the sun. When Jacob saw Eliza in her yard, she would offer a brief, tight-lipped nod instead of turning away. It was a small acknowledgement, but it felt significant. The sounds of his work, once perhaps an intrusion, now seemed to become a part of the landscape's daily rhythm. Progress on the boxcar was steady and deeply rewarding. He had installed the window he'd salvaged, and the interior was no longer a dark cave, but a space filled with dusty, golden light. He had built a sturdy bunk frame against one wall and was now tackling the most critical project, securing the roof before the autumn rains began. The work was precarious. He spent his afternoons balanced on the curved metal roof, the sun beating down on his back. His task was to replace several sections of rotted wood beneath the metal sheeting. It required peeling back the tin, prying out the soft, crumbling planks, and fitting new, solid ones he'd cut from reclaimed lumber. He was working on the last rotted section. He had just pulled a long, splintered plank free and was about to step over the gap to grab a new piece. He put his weight on the adjacent board, a board he had judged to be sound. There was a sickening crack. The wood, rotten from underneath in a way he hadn't seen, gave way instantly. His leg plunged through the roof up to his thigh. His other foot slipped on the slick metal, and for a terrifying second, the world tilted. He was falling. Instinct, honed by years of physical labor and military training, took over. He threw his arms out, his hands slamming down flat against the hot metal, his fingers scrabbling for purchase. His body twisted, the rough edge of the broken hole scraping violently against his leg. He managed to stop his fall, leaving him half in, half out of the roof, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He hung there for a moment, breathing heavily, the metallic smell of hot rust filling his nose. Slowly, carefully, he pulled his scraped leg out of the hole. He sat down heavily on a solid part of the roof, his whole body trembling not from the near fall, but from the shock wave of memory it had triggered. The crack of the wood, the feeling of the foundation giving way beneath him, the sudden, stomach-lurching sensation of everything falling apart. It wasn't 2025 anymore. It was 2024, and he was standing in his office, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to his accountant explain that it was over, that the big contract had fallen through, that the loans were being called in, that everything he and Sarah had built, every late night, every drop of sweat, was gone. It was the exact same feeling. The ground beneath his feet, which he had believed to be so solid, had simply disintegrated. He sat on that roof, the West Virginia sun warming his skin, but all he felt was the icy chill of that final, devastating failure. All the progress he had made here, all the sweat and effort, suddenly felt like a joke, a child playing with blocks, pretending to build something real. What was he doing? He was a 50-year-old man living in a tin can, patching a leaky roof with scraps. He wasn't building a legacy. He was just delaying the inevitable. The rot wasn't just in the wood. It was in him. The energy drained out of him, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The hammer felt impossibly heavy in his hand. The bright afternoon sun seemed harsh and mocking. He put his head in his hands, the rough texture of his palms scraping against his forehead. He wanted to give up. The thought was a quiet, seductive whisper. Just stop. Stop trying. Stop fighting. What was the point? Every time he tried to build something, it fell apart. He didn't know how long he sat there, a statue of defeat on his rusted throne. He was so lost in his own bleak thoughts that he didn't hear the screen door of the neighboring house creak open. Eliza had been in her kitchen, washing vegetables from her garden. She had heard the crack of the wood, followed by a clatter. Alarmed, she had looked out the window just in time to see Jacob's frantic scramble to stop his fall. Her first instinct was a jolt of fear, But then she saw him pull himself to safety and just sit. He didn't get up. He didn't curse or throw something. He just folded in on himself, his head in his hands, his entire body radiating a despair so profound she could feel it from across the yard. Her first thought was to turn away, to give him his privacy. Her second thought was colored by the ghost of her ex-husband, a man who had met every setback with that same kind of boneless collapse. But then she remembered the fence. She remembered the quiet competence, the way he had solved a problem without needing praise or acknowledgement. The man she had seen working day after day was not a man who gave up easily. What she was seeing now was something different. This was a man at the absolute bottom. Without making a conscious decision, she dried her hands, took a clean glass from the cupboard, and filled it with cold water from the tap. She walked out her door and across the grass, her footsteps quiet. Jacob didn't notice her until she was standing at the base of the boxcar. He looked up, his eyes dull and unfocused, and he half expected to see the same look of contempt she'd given him the first day. But she said nothing. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't offer advice. She simply reached up and placed the cool, sweating glass of water on the edge of the boxcar's frame, in a spot he could easily reach. Then she retreated. She walked back to her own porch, sat down on the top step, and simply waited. She didn't stare. She just sat, a quiet, unobtrusive presence. Jacob stared at the glass of water. It was such a simple thing, a glass of water, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. It was an acknowledgement, an act of profound, unspoken empathy. It didn't try to fix his problem. It didn't judge his despair. It just said, "I see you. You are here, and here is a glass of water." Slowly, his trembling hand reached out. He picked up the glass, the cool condensation a welcome shock against his skin. He took a long, slow drink. The water was just water, but it felt like it was washing away some of the dust from his soul. He looked over at Eliza, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. The crisis hadn't passed, but the crushing weight of it had lessened. A single, quiet act of kindness had pierced through his darkness, a tiny pinprick of light that was enough to show him the way back. It was the most profound conversation he'd had in years, and not a single word had been spoken. The silent moment on the porch step, with its unspoken offering of a glass of water, had been a turning point. It was a bridge built across the chasm of their mutual solitude. In the weeks that followed, the change was subtle but profound. The air between Jacob and Eliza was no longer charged with suspicion, but with a quiet, watchful curiosity. Their conversations were still brief, limited to practicalities about the weather or a question about a particular tool, but the defensive edge was gone. Jacob finished the roof, each new plank a testament to his renewed resolve. The near fall had shaken him, but Eliza's quiet act of empathy had steadied him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. It reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone in this wilderness. As September gave way to a crisp, golden October, the forest began its slow, beautiful surrender to winter. The vibrant greens of summer bled into brilliant yellows, oranges, and deep crimsons. The air grew sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. For Jacob, the beauty was secondary to the urgency it signaled. Winter in the West Virginia mountains was not something to be taken lightly. His relationship with Caleb had also thawed considerably. The 3-month labor agreement had come and gone, but Jacob still found himself at the scrapyard most mornings, helping out where he could. The arrangement had shifted from a formal bargain to a partnership built on earned respect. Caleb had seen the boxcar transform under Jacob's hands, had seen the man's relentless work ethic, and recognized a familiar discipline. One chilly morning, as they were securing a large tarp over a pile of scrap steel, Caleb squinted at the gray, pregnant sky. "Feels like snow is in the air," he grunted, his breath pluming in front of him. "This old mountain has a mean streak when she wants to. You insulated that tin can of yours?" "As best I can," Jacob replied, pulling a rope tight. "Used old wool blankets I found in one of the cars." stuffed them between the inner and outer walls. Caleb nodded slowly, his gaze assessing. That'll help, but it's the power you need to worry about. The lines out here are old. A heavy snow, a little ice, and they'll snap like twigs. You could be without power for days, even a week. Jacob's face was grim. He knew this was his biggest vulnerability. A fire would keep him from freezing, but a prolonged outage meant no light and no way to charge the small battery he used for his radio. I've been thinking about that, Jacob admitted. Caleb chewed on the inside of his cheek for a moment, then gestured with his head toward a cluttered shed at the back of the yard. Got an old generator in there, a military surplus model from the 1992nd. Thing is loud as a tank and drinks gas like a thirsty soldier, but it's never failed me. The pull cord's busted, but I reckon a man with your skills could rig a fix. He paused. Take it. Consider it a bonus for the work you've done. Jacob was taken aback. It was a significant offer, far more than simple charity. It was a sign of trust, a piece of vital equipment offered from one veteran to another, an acknowledgement that they were comrades in this quiet war against the elements. Caleb, I can't just... Didn't ask you. Caleb cut him off, his tone gruff to hide the sentiment. Just get it running before the first real storm hits. Now grab the other end of this rope. The generator became Jacob's new priority. He hauled it back to the boxcar, and as Caleb had predicted, it was a beast. But it was a machine, and machines were something Jacob understood. He spent 2 days taking it apart, cleaning the carburetor, checking the spark plug, and patiently engineering a new, sturdy handle for the pull cord. When he finally filled it with a splash of gas and gave a mighty heave, it roared to life with a deafening but beautiful shudder. The sound of self-reliance was loud, but it was music to his ears. With his shelter secured and a source of power established, Jacob's preparations entered their final phase. He became a man obsessed with firewood. He spent every spare moment with his axe, felling dead trees, sectioning the logs, and splitting them with a steady, rhythmic swing. He stacked the wood in a neat, towering pile against the side of the boxcar, a fortress wall against the coming cold. As he worked, his gaze would often drift across the clearing to Eliza's small house. His concern, once confined to his own survival, had quietly expanded its perimeter. He noticed things. He saw that her woodpile, while neat, was only half the size of his. He saw a shutter on an upstairs window that hung at a slight angle, a potential vulnerability in a high wind. He saw that the gutters along her roof were thick with fallen leaves, a recipe for ice dams when the snow came. He felt a protective instinct rise in him, a sense of duty that was as natural as breathing. He couldn't just march over there and take over. Their friendship was still too new, too fragile for that. Her pride was a high fence, and he had only just earned the right to stand on the other side of it. So he kept watch, a silent guardian. One afternoon, he split an extra load of wood, stacking it near the edge of his property. The next morning, it was gone, and a basket of late-season apples and a jar of honey had appeared in its place. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. The first snowflakes fell on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late November. They were large and wet, drifting down lazily, melting as soon as they touched the ground. But they were a warning. Jacob stood on the small porch he had built, a mug of hot coffee warming his hands. He watched the flakes dissolve on the dark earth. Cody stood beside him, whining softly, sensing the change in the air. Jacob reached down and stroked the dog's thick fur, his eyes looking past his own fortified shelter, past the trees, to the little house where a light had just flickered on in the kitchen window. The heart of winter was coming, and he was ready for it. He had to be, for more than just himself. The first gentle snowflakes of the afternoon were a lie. As dusk bled into a deep, starless night, the character of the storm changed. The lazy drift became a frantic, horizontal assault, driven by a wind that howled through the skeletal trees like a grieving animal. The world outside Jacob's small window dissolved into a churning chaos of white. Inside the boxcar, the warmth from the small wood stove fought a valiant but losing battle against the cold seeping through the metal walls. Jacob sat on his bunk, listening. He had lived through enough winters in enough harsh places to recognize the different voices of a storm. This one was not just passing through. It had come to settle in, to test the resolve of everything in its path. Cody lay by the stove, his ears twitching at every violent gust of wind, a low growl occasionally rumbling in his chest. Jacob's gaze was fixed on the single point of light visible through the blizzard, the warm, yellow square of Eliza's kitchen window. It was a small beacon of civilization in the overwhelming wilderness, a sign that he was not the only soul awake and listening to the storm's fury. He was just about to add another log to the stove when a sound tore through the wind's howl. It was not the groan of a tree bending, but the sharp, explosive crack of one breaking, followed by a deep, earth-shaking thud that vibrated through the floor of the boxcar. Instantly, the yellow square in the distance vanished, plunged into absolute blackness. Jacob was on his feet before the echo of the crash had faded. "Stay," he commanded Cody, his voice sharp and clear. The dog, sensing the urgency, immediately lay back down, his eyes wide and fixed on his master. There was no panic in Jacob's movements, only a swift, methodical efficiency. He pulled on his heavy winter gear, the worn brown leather jacket over his flannel shirt, insulated gloves, a thick wool cap. He checked the fuel in his lantern and lit it, its steady golden glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. He grabbed his heavy-duty axe from its place by the door and a long, sharp handsaw. He was no longer just a man in a boxcar. He was a soldier, and a mission had just presented itself. Stepping outside was like stepping onto another planet. The wind ripped at him, trying to tear the lantern from his grasp. The snow was already well past his ankles and drifting into deep pockets. The world he knew, the clearing, the trees, Eliza's house, was gone, replaced by a blinding, swirling vortex of white. He shielded the lantern with his body and began to trudge forward, leaning into the wind. Every step was a battle. The cold was a physical thing, a predator that clawed at any exposed skin. He kept his eyes locked on the spot where the light had been, using an old soldier's trick of navigating by instinct and memory when sight failed. He found the source of the crash halfway between their properties. A massive oak tree, a giant that had likely stood for a century, had succumbed to the storm. It had fallen directly across the narrow path, its thick trunk a formidable barrier. Worse, its upper branches had tangled with the power line, snapping it and pulling the pole at a dangerous angle. He didn't waste time assessing the power line. It was a problem for the utility company, whenever they could get through. The immediate problem was the tree. It blocked the way. It was a wall between him and his neighbors. He set the lantern down in a hollow at the base of the tree, its light creating a small bubble of reality in the chaos. He took up his axe, its weight familiar and comforting in his hands. He found his footing in the deep snow and began to swing. The work was brutal. The wind stole his breath and drove icy particles into his face. The axe bit deep into the frozen wood, sending chips flying into the darkness. It was a rhythmic, punishing labor. Swing, bite, recover. Swing, bite, recover. His world shrank to the small, illuminated circle of his work, the sound of his own ragged breathing, and the steady, percussive chunk of the axe. Inside her house, Eliza was trying to project a calm she did not feel. When the power went out, Maya had let out a small cry of fear. Eliza had immediately lit the kerosene lamps she kept for emergencies, their soft, flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "It's just an adventure, sweetie," she had said, her voice bright and cheerful, like camping indoors. But her heart was pounding. She had lived here her whole life. She knew what a storm like this could do. The isolation was the most terrifying part. There was no one to call, no way to get out if they needed to. She thought of the man in the boxcar and felt a pang of guilt. He was out there alone, likely in a colder, less secure shelter than hers. The thought was immediately followed by the bitter memory of her ex-husband who, during a bad storm years ago, had simply gotten in his car and driven to a friend's house in town, leaving her and a baby Maya to fend for themselves. She was staring out the window into the black, swirling abyss when she saw it. A light, a single, bobbing point of light, moving steadily through the storm. It was impossible. No one could be out in this. Then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, almost lost in the wind. A steady, determined chopping. She held her breath, her face pressed against the cold glass. The light was at the spot where the old oak tree stood. And someone was out there, in the heart of the blizzard, fighting it. It could only be one person. Jacob worked for what felt like hours. His arms burned, his back ached, and sweat, despite the freezing cold, ran down his temples. Finally, with a great groaning tear, the section of the trunk he had been working on split and fell away, creating a passage wide enough for a person to get through. He was gasping for breath, leaning on the handle of his axe, when a beam of light cut through the snow toward him. It was Eliza, holding a flashlight, her face pale and her expression a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Jacob?" she called out, her voice thin against the wind. "What are you doing?" "Clearing a path," he managed to say between breaths. "In case you needed to get out, or I needed to get in." She stared at the massive log he had cut through, then back at him. He was covered in snow, his face red from the cold and exertion, but his eyes were clear and steady. He hadn't done it for thanks or for show. He had done it because it needed to be done, because he was a man who saw a problem and fixed it, a man who stood his ground when things fell apart. He was a sentinel, a guardian standing watch in the storm. In that moment, the ghost of her past, the man who had always run away, finally vanished. It was replaced by the image of the man standing before her, covered in snow, holding an axe. A man who ran toward trouble, not away from it. "Come inside," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Please, come inside and get warm." Jacob stood frozen for a beat, the wind and snow swirling around him, Eliza's words, a pocket of impossible warmth in the frozen chaos. "Come inside," she had said. It was more than an invitation. It was a plea, an offering, a surrender of the walls she had so carefully built around herself. He gave a slow, tired nod. "My dog," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold and exertion. "I need to get my dog." "Bring him," Eliza said without hesitation. "Of course, bring him." And foregone. And had God force, it might foregone. The journey back to the boxcar was short, but it felt different. The oppressive loneliness of the storm was gone, replaced by a thread of connection that stretched through the blizzard back to the warm light of Eliza's house. He found Cody waiting patiently by the door, whining with relief when Jacob entered. He quickly checked the stove, banked the fire to keep it smoldering safely, and then clipped the leash onto Cody's collar. Walking into Eliza's house was like stepping into another world. The air was warm and smelled of kerosene, cinnamon, and something baking. The light from the lamps cast a soft, gentle glow over a space that was the complete opposite of his stark, functional boxcar. There were crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, a small pair of muddy boots by the door, and a worn, comfortable-looking sofa with a colorful Afghan draped over it. It was a home, filled with the quiet, lived-in energy of a family. Maya, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, was sitting at the small kitchen table. She gasped with delight when she saw Cody. "You brought your dog!" "He was cold, too," Jacob said, his voice softer than he intended. Eliza took their wet coats and hung them on hooks by the door. "There's stew on the stove," she said. "It's not much, but it's hot." The meal was one of the best Jacob had ever eaten. It was a simple beef stew, but it was rich and hot, and it warmed him from the inside out. They ate by lamplight, the storm still raging outside, but its power felt diminished, held at bay by the fragile circle of warmth inside the small kitchen. Maya, once she got over her shyness, chattered happily, asking Jacob 1,000 questions about Cody, about the boxcar, about whether he liked living in the woods. Her innocent prattling filled the spaces between the quiet, watchful adults, a gentle bridge between them. After dinner, Eliza declared it was past Maya's bedtime. After tucking her daughter into bed, she returned to the kitchen and poured 2 mugs of hot coffee. She sat down opposite Jacob, the table between them feeling both like a barrier and a shared space. Cody was now asleep at Jacob's feet, his occasional snores a comforting domestic sound. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There were 1,000 things to say, but the silence felt necessary, a moment to let the reality of the night settle. It was Eliza who finally broke it, her voice low. "You must think I'm a terrible person," she began, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her mug. "The way I was with you at the beginning. So hostile." Jacob shook his head. "You were just being cautious. A strange man moves into a derelict boxcar next door. I don't blame you." A sad, humorless smile touched her lips. "It was more than that," she said. And then she took a breath and began to speak, her words careful at first, then flowing more freely as she unburdened herself. She told him about her ex-husband, Maya's father, a man from the city who had swept her off her feet with grand promises of a better life, of taking her away from the small town she'd always known. "He was a charmer," she said, her voice laced with old pain. "He could talk anyone into anything, but he was a man made of words, not actions. When things got hard, when the reality of life didn't match the fantasy he'd built, he just faded. He hated the winters here. He said they were isolating, suffocating." She looked up, her eyes meeting Jacob's in the dim light. "During a bad ice storm, about 4 years ago, the power went out. Maya was just a toddler. He said he was going into town to find a hotel. He never came back." The story landed in the quiet kitchen with a heavy finality. It explained everything: her distrust, her fierce independence, her fear of a man who represented the same kind of failure, the same kind of flight from responsibility. Jacob listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he didn't offer empty platitudes or reassurances. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound understanding. Then, it was his turn. "I'm not that man, Eliza," he said softly. "But I know what it feels like to fail. I'd say." He told her about Sarah, about their shared dream. He spoke of the construction company, not with pride, but with the quiet sorrow of a man describing a fallen kingdom. He told her about the final year, the desperate gamble, the crushing weight of the bankruptcy, and the suffocating guilt of losing everything they had ever worked for. He explained how Sarah's death a year before the business failed had hollowed him out, and how the bankruptcy had felt like a second death, a final betrayal of her memory. "When I came here," he concluded, his voice barely a whisper, "I wasn't running to something. I was just running away from the man I had become. A failure. A man who couldn't protect what mattered most." In the flickering lamplight, they looked at each other, two survivors of different storms. They had shared the broken pieces of their pasts, and in doing so, had created something whole. The space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a rare and powerful understanding. The labels of neighbor and stranger had dissolved, replaced by something deeper, more resonant. They were comrades, allies, in the quiet art of healing. They were two lonely souls who had, in the heart of a winter storm, finally found a safe harbor in each other. The storm that had broken the great oak tree had also broken the back of winter. In the days that followed their shared confessions, the snow had continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in a deep, silent white. But it was a different kind of silence. The oppressive loneliness was gone, replaced by a shared solitude that felt more like peace. Jacob spent his days at the boxcar, putting the final touches on his home, while Eliza and Maya stayed in theirs. But now, they were 2 points of light in the wilderness, aware and protective of each other. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to change. The iron grip of the frost loosened. The days grew a fraction longer, the sunlight a little less pale. The snow began to recede from the edges of the clearing, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The sound of dripping water was a constant, gentle percussion, the mountain weeping away the last of its winter grief. Spring was coming not with a sudden burst, but with a quiet, persistent promise. By the time the last patches of snow had vanished and the first green shoots were pushing their way through the leaf litter, the boxcar was transformed. It was no longer a rusty relic, a monument to desperation. It was a home. Jacob had clad the exterior in reclaimed cedar planks, their silvered gray wood blending harmoniously with the surrounding forest. He had built a small, sturdy porch on the front, just wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table. The windows were clean, the roof was sound, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, a steady sign of life. His contract with Caleb was officially over, but their relationship had evolved. Jacob was no longer the desperate outsider. He was a fixture, a part of the landscape. He had earned his place through sweat and resilience. Caleb would often drive by in his pickup truck, slowing down to nod at Jacob's progress, a look of gruff approval in his eyes. He was now simply a neighbor, one who respected the quiet, capable man who had turned a piece of junk into a work of art. The real transformation, however, was in the space between the boxcar and the little house. The path Jacob had cleared through the fallen oak was now well worn. Maya was a frequent visitor, usually with Cody as her willing escort. She would arrive with a drawing for Jacob or a question about a bird she had seen, her bright, youthful energy a balm to his soul. Eliza came by often, too. She would bring him a mason jar of fresh milk or a loaf of still warm bread, her visits a comfortable, easy part of their new routine. They would stand on the porch, sipping coffee, and talk about simple things. The stubbornness of a particular weed, the progress of the power company in restoring the lines, the way the light hit the mountains in the late afternoon. They never spoke of the night of the storm again. They didn't need to. It was the foundation upon which this new, quiet trust was built. Jacob saw in her a strength he deeply admired, and she saw in him a steadfastness she had never known. The ghosts of their pasts hadn't vanished, but they no longer haunted the present. They had been acknowledged, named, and then gently laid to rest. One bright Saturday morning in early May, Jacob was sitting on his new porch, sanding a piece of wood for a window box. The air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and new growth. Cody was lying in a patch of sun, his tail thumping a lazy rhythm against the wooden planks. He heard the familiar sound of footsteps and looked up to see Eliza and Maya walking across the clearing. Maya was carrying a small, hand-drawn piece of paper. "We brought you the plans," she announced with great seriousness, handing the paper to Jacob. He took it and studied it. It was a child's drawing of a garden, with lopsided squares for vegetable patches and brightly colored circles for flowers. Little labels identified carrots and tomatoes and sunflowers. Eliza smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached her eyes. "Maya thinks your porch needs a garden in front of it. And she's right. It might for man's, Kafrid." Jacob looked from the drawing to Eliza's hopeful face. "A garden," he said, the word feeling good in his mouth. It was a word about the future, about putting down roots. "I think that's a fine idea." He set his sanding block aside and stood up. "Well, if we're going to do it, we should do it right. The soil is probably a bit rocky right here. We'll need to build a raised bed." And, just like that, they were a team, a family. He went to get his tools, while Eliza pointed out the best spot to catch the morning sun. Maya appointed Cody the official supervisor of the project. They spent the rest of the day working together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They measured and sawed the wood for the frame, their hands occasionally brushing. They shoveled the dark, rich soil, their laughter mixing with the songs of the birds in the trees. As the sun began to dip below the ridge, casting long, golden shadows across the clearing, they stood back to admire their work. It was just a simple wooden frame filled with dirt, but it was perfect. It was a promise. Later, they sat together on the porch, tired, and content. Maya was nestled between them, drowsing, her head resting against Jacob's arm. Cody lay at their feet, his chin on his paws, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. A gentle breeze rustled the new leaves on the trees. Jacob looked at Eliza, and she looked back at him. No words were needed. In her eyes, he saw not the guarded, wounded woman he had first met, but a partner, a friend, a beacon of warmth. And he knew that she no longer saw a failure, a man running from his past, but a sentinel, a builder, a man who had found his way home. He had come to this place seeking an escape, an end, but instead, he had found a beginning. This little plot of land, this salvaged boxcar, was no longer just a refuge. It was the last stop, the final, hopeful destination at the end of a long, hard journey. It was home. Sometimes, the end of one road is simply the beginning of a new path. Jacob's story reminds us that hope can be rebuilt from the simplest materials, a forgotten piece of land, a loyal companion, and the quiet kindness of a neighbor. A true home is not found, but forged in the heart of compassion. If this story of renewal and companionship touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. Your likes and shares help these tales find a home with others who need to hear them. Please consider subscribing to continue this journey with us, and we hope you'll join us for our next story waiting for you right now on your screen.